Once again, thank you so much for those of you who've come this morning, and also for those of you who are looking at us via live stream at this wonderful series. It's my honor to turn the program over to Dr. James Bruckner, Professor of Old Testament and Distinguished Professor of the Paul Brandel Chair of Biblical Interpretation, who will moderate our session this morning and introduce our guest speaker. Can we give Dr. Bruckner a warm welcome?
Good morning. We have two lectures this morning. We start now at 9, and we will, after about 50-minute lecture, we will have a time for question and answer, and that will conclude about 10:15. We take a 30-minute coffee break and come back at 10:45 for the second lecture. Dr. Nancy deClaisse-Walford is the Carroll Ward Professor of Old Testament and Biblical Language at Mercer University in Atlanta, Georgia. Her PhD in Old Testament is from Baylor University, and she holds a degree in Semitic languages and literature from Fuller Theological Seminary. She's also the director of the MATS program academic research track at McPhee School of Theology at Mercer. Her expertise and excellent reputation is in Hebrew, biblical studies, and all things Psalms. She's also the Old Testament editor for the Word Biblical Commentary series and Review and Expositor Journal. In addition to her dozens of published articles, she has numerous books, including my favorites, Biblical Hebrew, an introductory textbook, Chalice Press, 2002, a good way to get started. In 2014, The Shape and Shaping of the Book of Psalms, the Current State of Scholarship, Ancient Israel and Its Literature, SBL Press. She's the editor of that volume, contributor. And in 2014, the Book of Psalms, Nikot series, New International Commentary in the Old Testament, published by Erdman's, co-authored with Rolf Jacobson and Beth Tanner. That series is edited by our own Bob Hubbard, Old Testament Professor Emeritus, and I have a special interest in this Psalms commentary and its publication. In the fall of 2000, yes, 18 years ago, I just read a chapter in a new book by Dr. deClaisse-Walford, The Canonical Shape of the Psalms. It was in an introduction to wisdom literature in the Psalms by, in honor of Marvin Tate. Now, Bob Hubbard and I were and are close colleagues. He asked me if I knew any young Psalms scholars, because he needed somebody to write the Psalms commentary. Actually, I did. I'd done my MDiv with Rolf Jacobson up at Luther, and I just read this new article, one of the most enlightening canonical approaches to the Psalms by Dr. deClaisse-Walford. I gave him both names, Nancy and Rolf. 14 years later, with Beth Tanner, their work is the best standard of Psalms scholarship and commentary on the planet. If you don't have the book, buy it. It's the one Psalms commentary you need. In addition to her publications, Dr. deClaisse-Walford is a committed classroom teacher. I quote her, she says, "I know that whatever I say in the classroom may be appropriated into a Bible study, a Sunday school lesson, or a sermon. What a tremendous responsibility and frightening joy. It is challenging and tremendously rewarding. Students daily provide my motivation to be the best scholar and teacher I can be. We are in good company." Dr. deClaisse-Walford and her husband are Genesis 2 people, gardeners. And God planted a garden. They grow figs, grapes, blackberries, tomatoes, cucumbers, kale, and they can jam. Interpretation? Not rock on. Put up preserves. Her first lecture today comes out of her expertise and is titled, it is on Psalm 93 to 99, Let the Floods Clap Their Hands, an ecological feminist reading of the Enthronement Psalms. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Nancy deClaisse-Walford.
Am I good to go? You can hear me? Okay. I was a young scholar in 2000. Thank you very much. No longer. But yes, it was a delightful surprise to be asked to contribute to the commentary. And 14 years later, commentary writing is a long process. So 14 years later, yes, published. And as you'll find out in the next lecture, I'm working on yet another commentary. I always swore I wouldn't do another one, but you know how that goes. This morning, we're going to start with Let the Floods Clap Their Hands, an ecological feminist reading of the Enthronement Psalms. We're going to examine this group of psalms first, and then in the second lecture, we're going to look at the songs of ascents. And we're going to take two different viewpoints. And the purpose to explore the various ways in which we readers in the 21st century may approach and appropriate the words which were recited and then written down some 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And so, to begin, as we work our way into the Psalter, a bit of background information on the Book of Psalms to kind of help us orient ourselves to the topics we'll explore both in this lecture and the next one. The Psalms are a magnificent collection of human poetry, the words of our Israelite ancestors in the faith poured out in many expressions. Heartfelt lament, Psalm 22's, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning. Cries for help, Psalm 13's, consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. Words of awe, Psalm 8. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Words of admonition, Psalm 837. Do not fret because of the wicked. Do not be envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Words of hope and encouragement, Psalm 94. When I thought my foot is slipping, your steadfast love, O Lord, held me up. When the cares of my heart are many, your consolations cheer my soul. And outburst of joyous praise. Psalm 146. Praise the Lord, O my soul. I will praise the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praises to God my whole life long. The origins of the individual psalms are buried deep within the history of ancient Israel. Many appear to have oral origins, words repeated over and over again through the generations. Others appear to have written origins, poetry composed specifically for cult and didactic functions. It's hard to identify definitively which are which. But the Book of Psalms has been called the hymn book of ancient Israel. Psalms appear in every reading in the Jewish prayer book, just as they do in the various lectionaries of Christian churches. They are well-loved and well-used compositions that give us some insight into humanity's understanding of God and humanity's relationship with God. And scholars have given the Book of Psalms much attention. Perhaps the most influential modern student of the Book of Psalms was one Hermann Gunkel, a German scholar who worked in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He is known as the great father, or perhaps I should say ancestor, of what we in the Guild call form criticism. Gunkel observed, as anyone might who looks closely at the Psalms, that a great variety of literary forms made up the book. He thus categorized the Psalms by type, that is, Gattung, individual laments, such as Psalms 3 and 7, community laments, such as Psalms 74 and 80, individual hymns of thanksgiving, Psalms 34 and 116, community hymns, 117, 124, and then wisdom psalms like Psalm 1 and 32, creation psalms such as Psalm 8 and 19, royal psalms, Psalms 2 and 20, and enthronement psalms, Psalms 95 and 96, some of which we are going to be examining in this morning's lecture. Gunkel's contribution to the study of the Psalter is immeasurable. He gave us a marvelous gift of classification that has enhanced and enriched our understanding of the great variety of poetic forms in the books. Scholars preparing lectures and manuscripts, students writing papers, clergy writing sermons and lessons, and popular authors musing on the Psalms all knowingly or unknowingly incorporate Gunkel's work on the Psalms into their own understanding. When preparing an Easter meditation on Psalm 22, for instance, the word lament is a necessary part of the Psalm's description. And yet, the usual Hebrew word for lament, kinyah, doesn't even appear in the Psalter. Gunkel's work was seminal. We would be the poorer without it. But as is usually the case, with every good comes some perils. And the case of Hermann Gunkel's classification of the Psalms is no different. Early in my PhD studies at Baylor University in Texas, I came across an article by one Robert Poulsen, who was at that time a professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. The article in the journal Semea was titled, "The Ancestress of Israel in Danger, in Danger." Got that? Okay, it examines the three stories in the book of Genesis about Abraham and Isaac passing off their wives as their sisters. Poulsen addresses the work of source and form critics who are attempting to, according to him, quote, resurrect the original story behind the three versions with little concern for how the stories fit into their present literary context. One sentence in the article seized my attention and has stuck with me over the years. Poulsen writes, traditional biblical scholarship has spent most of its efforts in disassembling the works of a complicated watch before our amazed eyes, without apparently realizing that similar efforts by and large have not succeeded in putting the parts back together again in a significant or meaningful way. Poulsen invites us to picture a magnificent timepiece made up of cogs and wheels, springs and tiny mechanisms, delicate hands and precious stones, each with its own place in the dance of the whole. We dissect the timepiece. We lay it out on a table or a workbench, piece by piece. We study it and marvel at the beauty, the intricacy, and the craftsmanship. Then a passerby stops to observe our work and finally asks, "What is it?" And we reply, "A watch." "Oh, well, what does it do?" the observer asks. "Well, it keeps time," we respond. "Really? Wonderful? Show me how it works," says the passerby. And we try our best, but we are unable to reassemble the watch, to restore it to the form in which we found it, so that once again it can perform the task for which it was created, to keep time. The disassembled watch, the dissected biblical text, a wonderful metaphor. Much of the work of biblical scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries was focused on dissecting the text, searching for strands of tradition and original oral settings. In what ways did Hermann Gunkel's contribute to the dissection, particularly of the Book of Psalms? Well, his categorization of the various types of psalms led many who study the book to regroup the psalms into their various categories and study them together, not in psalm number order. Psalms 1, 2, and 3, and so forth, but by type, all of the individual laments, all of the creation psalms, all of the individual hymns of thanksgiving, and so forth. In essence, students dissected the Psalter into its individual parts and largely ignored the composition as a whole in its canonical shape. The Psalter is not broken into sections by psalm type, but by books. And in each book, we find a mix of psalm types. Book 1, for instance, Psalms 1 through 41, opens with a wisdom psalm, continues with a royal psalm, and then follows with a mix of individual laments, creation psalms, community hymns, royal psalms, and so forth. And notice I'm using Gunkel's categorization here. Again, he gave us a great gift for understanding the Psalms. And so a passerby stops and observes the work of form critics studying the Psalter and asks, "What is it?" And we reply, "It's a collection of the voices of our ancestors in the faith, expressing their joys, sorrows, petitions, questions, and awe to God." "Really?" the passerby says. "Wonderful. Can I have a look? Can I see?" And we lay out before them the individual laments, then the community hymns, then the creation psalms, and so forth, pristinely and discreetly ordered and categorized. But that's not how the human voice, the human emotion, expresses itself. We move fluidly, one moment to the next, between lament and praise, awe and jadedness, joy and sorrow. And so the presentation to the passerby is sterile, devoid of true human emotion, a staunch reminder that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Some group of our ancestors in the faith shaped this book of Psalms into the form that we have it today. And that shape was not a careful division of various psalms into psalm types into chapters or books. So what do we have? How do we understand the shape of the book of Psalms? If not by psalm type, then what? What compelled the organizing of the book as we know it today? Have you ever asked yourself, why is Psalm 1 Psalm 1 and Psalm 150 Psalm 150? What if Psalm 137, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept," were the first psalm in the Psalter? Or even if Psalm 150 were the first psalm in the Psalter? And then, why these 150 psalms? There were many more in circulation in ancient Israel. We have evidence from the Hebrew Bible, Exodus 15, Habakkuk 3, for example. In the mid-20th century, Brevard Childs of Yale University championed an approach to the biblical text he called canonical criticism. Text into its most minute components, a la Polzen's wonderful watch, and moved toward examining the text in the form in which it was preserved for communities of faith. That is, as a whole, as we find it in our biblical texts. He states, "The final form of the Hebrew Scriptures is what the ancient Israelites preserved, not the underlying layers of tradition of which it consists. Therefore, the best critical method for understanding its message is to study its final shape, that which became normative for all successive generations of this community of faith." James Sanders of Claremont University in California shared Brevard Childs' interest in studying the final form of the biblical text. In 1977, he voiced his own call for a reevaluation of the way scholars approach biblical texts. He writes, "The biblical story has become eclipsed by the work of the very professionals in seminaries and departments of religion who seem to know most about the Bible. The experts have lost perspective on the very object of their expertise and have reduced the Bible to grist for the historian's mill, the province of the professor's study." We can identify with that, can't we? Each psalm in the Psalter was composed by some individual, many most likely, as I said earlier, in oral settings. And each psalm may have been used in ancient Israel's worship experience. But whatever the provenance, each was remembered, valued, repeated, and passed on within the various communities of faith. Communities found values in the stories and texts of which the Hebrew Bible was composed, or those stories and texts would never have been preserved, written down, and handed on. That is, they, the stories and the texts, provided base answers to basic existential questions, including, who are we? Where did we come from? And where are we going? The ancient Israelites repeatedly asked these questions of and found answers to them in their traditions, the stories and texts that they passed on from generation to generation. Sanders steadfastly maintains that biblical texts are grounded in historical settings, that these settings can be discovered, and that they are important for understanding the shapes of texts. He writes again, "There has been a relationship between tradition, written and oral, and community, a constant, ongoing dialogue, a historical memory passed on from generation to generation in which the special relationship between canon and community resided. Community is thus the foundation of canon. Discovering the hermeneutics of the communities that shape their traditions into canon is the foundation of the study of the shape and shaping of biblical texts." And that brings us to the next era in the study of the Book of Psalms. Gerald Wilson, a student at Yale, but surprisingly not a student of Childs, a student at Yale in the 1980s, built on the works of Childs and Sanders and wrote a dissertation and subsequent book titled The Editing of the Hebrew Psalter. Basically, Wilson argues that the Psalter's 5 books, Psalms 1 through 41, 42 through 72, 73 through 89, 90 through 106, and 107 through 150, that these 5 books evince purposeful editing and that they told a story to the ancient Israelites, a story about their past history, their present situation, and their hope for the future. Wilson organized a study into 2 large undertakings. First, to isolate and describe whatever evidence might exist of editorial activity within the Psalter, and to evaluate the extent of its unifying influence, what we now call the shape of the Psalter. And second, to determine the editorial purpose that governed that organizational process, what we now call the shaping of the Psalter. He concludes that the Psalms of the Psalter were a post-exilic arrangement that narrated the history of ancient Israel, beginning with the rise of Israel under the leadership of Kings David and Solomon, as narrated in books 1 and 2 of the Psalter, Psalms 1 through 72, continuing with the demise of the northern kingdom and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in book 3, Psalms 73 through 89, the exile in Babylon in book 4, Psalms 90 through 106, and ending with the return from exile, the rebuilding of the temple, the restoration of worship, and the new hope for existence in the future with Yahweh as sovereign or king. And that comes in book 5, Psalms 107 through 150. The point, the message of the book, Israel can survive in its post-exilic reality if they embrace God as sovereign over them, not an earthly king. The people have been allowed to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild their temple, and to worship their God Yahweh, but they cannot have a king. They are vassals of the Persian Empire. The closing words of Wilson's book are, Yahweh is eternal king. Only he is ultimately worthy of trust. Human princes will wither and fade like the grass, but the steadfast love of Yahweh endures forever. Thus, the mixing of the various psalm types within the 5 books of the Psalter, rather than grouping them together by psalm type, was purposeful, part of the storytelling, if you will. Wilson succeeded, I believe, in putting the magnificent timepiece back together so that it could perform the task for which it was created. Gunkel had done his work well, had given us the tools to interpret the great variety of literary types that we encounter as we read the Book of Psalms. And Childs and Sanders and Wilson did their work well, giving us first the permission and then the tools to read the Psalter as an integrated whole, a purposefully shaped document of identity and understanding for our post-exilic ancestors in the faith. Book 4, the location of the Enthronement Psalms that we're going to examine, reflects and narrates the time of exile in Babylon. Jerusalem has been destroyed, the people are no longer resident in the land of promise, and there is no king, no temple. The opening psalm of Book 4, Psalm 90, is titled, in its superscription, A Prayer of Moses, the Man of God. Psalm 90 invites the post-exilic Israelites, as they contemplate their time of exile in Babylon, to think back to the time of the wilderness wanderings, the last time they were outside the land, waiting anxiously to enter it and possess it. So here we have 3 time frames, if you will. The post-exilic community, who is the audience of the Psalter story, reflecting in Book 4 on the exilic experience, and called to remember the wilderness wanderings. So keep those 3 time frames in mind. Thus, the words of Book 4 are addressed to a people wondering what it is all about, called to reflect on their rich history. And now on to the main topic, the Enthronement Psalms. As we approach them, we immediately confront a dilemma that may cause difficulty for some who are reading them. In them we find over and over the words, God is King, as we do in many other psalms. For the purpose of this lecture, though, I will refer not to the kingship of God, but to the sovereignty of God, a little more inclusive, if you will, a different way to speak about God in these psalms. And while God as king or sovereign is arguably the dominant image of God in the Psalter, it is not the only image or metaphor for God in the book. William P. Brown, in his 2002 work, Seeing the Psalms, reminds us that when a metaphor, which is precisely what the kingship, sovereignty of God is, when that metaphor becomes literalized to a point of excluding other metaphors for the same subject, the metaphor, no matter how profound, becomes absolutized, as though it were itself considered ultimate. The beauty of metaphoric imagery for God in the Psalter is that it allows for a multiplicity of conceptualizations, or as Louis Alonzo Shekel suggests, a vast collection of interwoven images. Some examples of other images of God in the book of Psalms. One powerful one has its roots in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. There God pronounces God's self-identity, and one of the words used is rachum, translated most often as compassionate, as we see in the Common English Bible, the New American Standard, the NIV, and the New Revised Standard, or merciful, as we see in the Authorized Version. The word derives from the root rechem, which means literally womb. Thus, God's compassion or mercy is tied closely to the concept of womb love, the love a mother feels for her yet-to-be-born child. References to God's rachum, God's womb love, occur no less than 22 times in the book of Psalms. Another prominent metaphor for God in the Psalter is that of refuge, often imagined as shelters under the wings, the kanafayim of God. We read in Psalm 17:8, "Guard me as the apple of the eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings." And in 61:4, "Let me abide in your tent forever, find refuge under the shelter of your wings." Protective wings bring to mind the image of a mother hen caring for her young, keeping them warm, providing shelter, and warding off predators, as we see in Jesus' words in Matthew 22:37. And don't tell any of my Old Testament students I went to the New Testament. I don't allow them to do that. Another image occurs in Psalm 90, verse 2, an image to which I will return later in this lecture. In 90, verse 2, we read, according to the New Revised Standard Version, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world." Brought forth is the Hebrew word yalad, to beget, while formed is the Hebrew chil, to writhe or twirl, almost always used in the Hebrew Bible to refer to childbirth. See the references on the screen. 2 in particular, Deuteronomy 32:8, the Song of Moses. It says, "You were unmindful of the rock that bore, yalad, you. You forgot the God who gave you birth, chil." And in Proverbs 8, verses 24 and 25, woman wisdom says, when there were no depths, I was brought forth, Chil. Before the hills, I was brought forth, Chil. So, a wonderful image of a birthing God. Finally, wisdom is a prominent feature in the Psalter. The book equates wisdom with Torah, specifically in Psalms 1 and 119, thereby inviting the reader to hear in the wisdom psalms and the wisdom elements of the psalms the voice of woman wisdom, the feminine iteration of Yahweh, if you will, calling humankind to search out the path to a right relationship with Yahweh through obedience to the Torah. Claudia Kant maintains, in fact, that in the Psalter, wisdom actually replaces the earthly king, the earthly sovereign, as the mediator between God and humanity. And that brings us then back to the Enthronement Psalms. I know I keep circling around them, but we are going to get there. These psalms declare God's, or perhaps woman wisdom's, sovereignty over the world. Let's begin with Psalm 93, the first of the Enthronement Psalms, at least the ones in Book 4. It opens with the words, and this is my translation, "The Lord reigns, is robed in majesty, as well the habitable world stands firm. It will not be shaken." The word I translate as habitable world is tevel, which refers to the earth's habitable spaces, places of solidity and permanence. The word occurs 6 times in the 7 enthronement psalms, and interestingly, it occurs as well in Psalm 90, the opening psalm of Book 4. There we read, and we saw it in verse 2, which we'd already visited, that God gave birth, Chil, to the earth, the Eretz, and the habitable world, the Tevel. Psalm 93:1 states that this habitable world, birthed by God, is firmly established. It cannot be shaken. Verses 3 and 4 of Psalm 93 abound with language about water, language that conjures up images of overwhelming inundation, the voice and the crashing of waves of rivers in verse 3, the thundering of breakers of the great waters and the sea in verse 4. Water was a common metaphor for chaos in ancient Near Eastern myths, chaos that needed to be overcome in order to create the world. Recall especially the Babylonian creation story of Enuma Elish, in which Marduk defeats the water goddess Tiamat and forms the earth out of her slain carcass. And recall that many scholars maintain that the deep, the Tehom in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, is a reference to the watery primordial chaos that God overcame in the process of birthing, as Psalm 90 tells us, the process of birthing the habitable world. According to Psalm 93, the chaotic waters that threatened are less majestic than the majesty of God. I will not deal here with Psalm 94. Many think it should not be included in the Enthronement Psalms because of its imprecatory nature. That's a subject beyond the scope and time of this morning's lecture, although I'm going to be talking about the imprecatory Psalms later on in the week. But I do have my opinion, which is that it should be included in the Enthronement Psalms. But on to Psalm 95. It begins with a call to give a ringing cry, renan, translated in the New Revised Standard as sing. Waters it down, doesn't it? Here we find another connection with Psalm 90. The verb renan in Psalm 95:1 recalls the request of the psalm singers in Psalm 90, verse 14, who say to God, "Satisfy us in the morning so that we may rejoice," according to the New Revised, but give a ringing cry, renan, and be glad all our days. In Psalm 95, thus, God has answered the requests of the singers of Psalm 90 and now protects, provides for, and nurtures God's people. The verb give a ringing cry, renan, is almost always used in a positive sense in the Hebrew Bible and is connected with joyous outbursts, never with cries of oppression, warfare, and so forth. In Psalm 90, the people hoped for a time when they could give a ringing cry. Now here in Psalm 95, the time for giving a ringing cry has arrived. What's very interesting to me is that Renan is often used to describe various non-human members of creation, praising their creator God. In 1 Chronicles 16:33, the trees of the forest, Renan, give a ringing cry. Job 39:13, a beautiful image, the wings of the ostrich, Renan, picture it. In Psalm 89, verse 12, Mount Tabor and Mount Hermon give a ringing cry. In 98:8, the mountains. And in Jeremiah 51, the heavens and the earth give a ringing cry. The final verses of Psalm 95, verses 8 through 11, recall the Israelites' rebelliousness against Moses and God during the wilderness wanderings. Remember, in this book, the Israelites are called to remember the wilderness wandering time. The story of Meribah and Massah is about provision of water for the people. It occurs not long after God delivered them from the Egyptian army at the Red Sea. Exodus 17, 1 through 7, tells us that the people camped at Rephidim, but there was no water to drink. The people complained against Moses, saying, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" God then instructs Moses to strike the rock at Horeb with his staff, and water comes gushing out. The God who tamed the chaotic waters at creation, Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, and provided water to the thirsty Israelites in the wilderness, continues to provide the essential elements of life to God's people. The words of Psalm 95, verses 8 through 11, would have been powerful words to the Israelite women and men in exile in Babylon, and members of the post-exilic community, and can be powerful words to women and men living in numerous wildernesses today. Psalm 95 reminds humanity of the good provision of God to them despite their quarreling and complaining, as we see in the book of Exodus. Psalm 96, verse 1, calls the people to sing to the Lord a new song, a shir chadash. And in verse 9, the psalmist calls on all the earth to tremble before the Lord. The word translated tremble in the New Revised is from the same verbal root, chil, that I translated as birthed in Psalm 90, verse 2. God birthed the earth, the eretz, and the habitable world, the tevel, and now the earth is called to participate with God in the ongoing creative birthing process. But the verb chil is an interesting lexical study. It is closely related to and often combined lexically with chul, to twirl and dance, allowing for a variety of ways to understand its meaning in various contexts. Arthur Walker Jones in The Green Psalter translates Psalm 96, verse 9 as, "Worship the Lord in sacred glory, dance before him, all the earth." Walker Jones's translation provides yet another means of tying Psalm 96, verse 9 to Psalm 90, verse 2. Is God in Psalm 96 calling the earth that God birthed in Psalm 90 to joyously dance in God's presence? Or is the earth to tremble, to writhe along with God at God's wondrous birthing of the earth and the habitable world? Whether we understand the verb to mean writhe in childbirth or twirl and dance, the psalm singer calls upon the earth to participate in one way or another in the new song of Psalm 96 in answer to the work of God in creation. Psalm 97, verse 4, states that the habitable world, the tevel, responds to the presence of God using that same verbal root again, chil. In Psalm 96:9, the psalm singer calls on the habitable world to either birth or twirl and dance using the imperative form of the verb. In 97:4, the habitable world either births or twirls and dance, and here we have the imperfect verbal form. Thus, the call, an imperative in Psalm 96, is answered by a realization of that call in Psalm 97. The habitable world now births or dances in concert with God who birthed that world, thereby participating in one way or another in that creative process. The image of the habitable world dancing before God in Psalms 96 and 97 conjures up the image of Exodus 15, verses 20 and 21, where the prophet Miriam leads the women in dance. And here's a noun derived from either chil or chul. Leads the women in dance to celebrate the defeat of the Egyptians whom God had thrown into the sea. The Creator God, who overcame the watery chaos at creation and birthed the earth and the habitable world, controls the waters and delivers the people from Egypt. And the women, very much a part of this habitable world that God created, lead out in dance. Psalm 97, verses 8 and 9. Oops, let's move that ahead. Psalm 97, verses 8 and 9 state, Zion hears and is glad, and the daughters, that is, the towns of Judah, rejoice. For you, O Lord, are exalted far above all gods. Zion, the towns of Judah. For the Israelites, a place to call home, to nurture the young and care for the old, and to live out their callings in life. The God of the Enthronement Psalms cares deeply about creation, about the inclusion of all creation in celebration of God's sovereignty. But what about humanity? How do we understand and discuss the relationship between humanity and the rest of creation? For any study of that relationship, an examination of the creation stories in Genesis is necessary. In Genesis 1, verse 28, God says to the newly created human creatures, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." The Hebrew word translated dominion in the New Revised is radah, which indeed connotes the idea of power over or dominion. As well, in Genesis 2:19, we read, "Out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the human to see what the human would call them. And whatever the human called every living creature, that was its name." Have dominion, subdue, name. It appears that humanity has something of a privileged, superior position in the created order. And the theme continues in the book of Psalms. In Psalm 8, verses 3 through 6, for instance, the psalmist marvels, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you've made them a little lower than God," or the gods. "You've given them dominion." But here the word is not radah, but mashal, meaning either to rule over, but it can also mean to be wise or to be wise over, the topic of a whole nother lecture. So either have dominion as in rule, or have dominion as in be wise over the works of your hands. You've put all things under their feet. I have over the years taught my students that humanity is called to be co-creators with God and co-caretakers of God's good, very good creation. That view has helped me, and I hope them, appropriate the dominion and subdue language that we read in Genesis 1 and the rule over, be wise over language of Psalm 8. I maintain that humanity is not given carte blanche to have dominion, subdue, and rule over, to deplete the earth's natural resources, to destroy animal habitats, to build habitats for ourselves, to use and misuse creation for our own devices, but rather to care for creation as God, who gave birth to it, would care for it. And so what if we studied the creation language of the Hebrew Bible more closely, especially the creation language we encounter in the Enthronement Psalms, in our quest to understand humanity's position within the created order? Dominion, subdue, and rule over fit well within the language of the powerful, those in control. But what about those who are not in control, those who have little or no power? In the book, The Bible and Ecology, Richard Balcombe, a professor at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, states, "The image of a community of creation in which we humans are fellow members with God's other creatures is a helpful way of synthesizing important aspects of the relevant biblical material. It also provides a broader context within which to situate the special and distinctive roles of humans in creation, recognizing these without lifting humans out of creation as though we were demigods set over it. All God's creatures are first and foremost creatures, ourselves included. All earthly creatures share the same earth, and all participate in an interrelated and interdependent community." The Enthronement Psalms that we've examined this morning convey that message well. Psalm 93, which incidentally never mentions humanity, celebrates the firm stability of the world, the travail that God has birthed. It shall never be shaken. In response, in verse 3, the rivers and streams have lifted up their voices with pounding waves. And verse 4 tells us that God is more majestic than the height of many waters. Recall again that water was a common metaphor for chaos in ancient Near Eastern myths, chaos that had to be overcome in order to create the world. Not in the case of Psalm 93, though. The very elements usually seen as sources of chaos lift their voices together to celebrate the majesty of God. Psalm 95 invites humanity to join in the joyful song, the ringing cry, the renan, adding its voice to the voice of the pounding waves. And what is that joyful song, that ringing cry, all about? Verses 4 and 5 of Psalm 95 sum it up well. Because in God's hands are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are God's also. The sea is God's, for God made it, and the dry land, which God's hands have formed. In Psalm 96, verse 1, the psalmist calls on the whole earth to sing to the Lord a new song and tremble or dance, chil, before God. The voice and actions of humanity mix with the voice and actions of all creation in a celebration of God's rule over the world. And we find the same language in Psalm 97. In Psalm 96, as we said earlier, the whole earth is called to tremble or dance in the imperative voice. In Psalm 97, the whole earth responds to the call with trembling or dancing. Over and over again in the Enthronement Psalms, not just humanity, but all creation celebrates God's sovereignty over the created world. And nowhere in their words do I find any reference to a superior position of humanity within creation. We humans, and this world around us, all of us are God's good creation, placed on this earth for a purpose, a part of the larger divine directive. In this view, what is the meaning of the words subdue and have dominion of being co-creators? How do we proceed? Should humanity intervene in threatened extinctions of various species of plants and animals? Should humanity assume the role of God in maintaining the cosmic order? Or should humanity accept that there's a natural ebb and flow to the cosmos? And ought we to accept that while we can control many things we cannot? I end with the words of Richard Balcombe again. Cosmic humility, and that's one of my favorite terms, is a much-needed ecological virtue. We need the humility to recognize that our place in the world is a limited one. We need the humility to walk more lightly upon the earth, with more regard for the life around us. We need the humility to recognize the unforeseeable risks of technology before we ruin the world in pursuit of technological fixes to all our problems. We need the humility to know ourselves as creatures within creation, not gods over creation. The humility of knowing that only God is God. Life was difficult for our ancestors in the faith, and it is difficult for the faithful today. I'm sure that many, especially those on the outside, those living more, if you will, on the underside of society, wondered and still wonder about this God, Yahweh, whom they worship. The words of the Psalms in Book 4, I maintain, reminded the post-exilic people of their groundedness, the essence of their being. God created this world. We humans understand that we have a special place in it, that we can have dominion and subdue, but in the end, we are part and parcel of this wonderful, good created order, and we must accept and thankfully embrace our place within it and be wise over it. And that, I maintain, is a powerful message of cosmic humility, to use Balcom's words, to those of us who live in the more privileged place in our world today. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Let the sea thunder, the inhabitable world, and all that fills it. The rivers and streams clap their hands, and the mountains sing for joy. And that'll preach. Amen and amen.
So we have about 20 minutes to ask questions and hear Dr. deClaisse-Walford's responses. A couple of instructions. First, when you ask your question, I'll bring you a microphone. Stand and tell us who you are and something about your relationship to this place as a courtesy. And keep your question fairly short, too. Thank you. All right, who has the first question?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kristen Brody, a graduate of the seminary. I had a question that might be random, but which is fine. So in this idea of twisting or twirling, so in childbirth, the child has to turn at the very end as part to get out of its mother's body. Is that at all part of the of that word, or is it mostly this idea of a woman writhing in pain? Because that's what came up for me pretty strongly when you're talking, this idea that the child does have to participate in its own birth by turning on its side. So I don't know if that's at all part of the word or part of the understanding.
I'm going to steal that from you, if that's all right. I think that's a wonderful way to say that the earth, the habitable world, is involved with God in that creation, and we're part of that. Yeah, may I steal that from you? I'll footnote you or something. Yeah, that's great. That both the birthing person and the one being given birth to, both go through that writhing and turning. So good, excellent.
Another question.
Stunned silence. Right, okay.
Hello. Sorry. I'm Dr. Nathan Clayton. We just met briefly. I'm the new Old Testament fellow here.
Always scary when the Old Testament person asks you a question. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I would just comment, one of the things I appreciated the most was the rootedness in the biblical data, the lexical forms. I very much appreciated that. I just had a general comment, maybe that you could comment further.
Okay.
You know how Psalm 89 first says, you were faithful to David, but now, in the middle of the psalm, and then we come to Psalm 90. I'm just wondering, maybe for the benefit of the audience, you could comment further on the relationship between cosmic humility and God's covenantal engagement in the world, culminating maybe with David. How do you see Davidic covenant issues relating in the post-exilic period? Do you know what I'm getting at? That's a big comment for you.
Okay, all right. That covenant with David, it was always contingent upon obedience to God. I go back to the covenant at Sinai, that contingent on being obedient to the Torah instructions. And I think that when we look at the narrative of the destruction of Jerusalem, Babylonian exile, and all of that, it's a reflection of the people's rejection of fidelity to that covenant. And so Psalm 89 is a very strong reflection of that celebration at the beginning of Psalm 89 of the covenant with David, that it would never be broken except. And then we end with this lament at the end of Psalm 89. And then we move right to Psalm 90, which says, a psalm of Moses. Well, that takes the people back to a time before kingship, when they were in the wilderness and they had to rely completely on God. And God was patient, so was Moses, completely on God and Moses to bring them through. So I think that's the relationship there, that this covenant, this promise, really had to do, though, with fidelity to the Torah. And, yeah.
Hi, I'm Mary Chase Solik, and I'm on the faculty here at the seminary, teaching in the area of health ministries, the intersection between faith and health. And certainly our relationship to the created world has a lot to do with our own well-being. But I was intrigued by, in your introduction and in your ending, talking about how what we teach is lived out in the church. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you might encourage your students to use these biblical interpretations and understanding of our relationship to creation in responding to the contemporary ecological challenges we faced in our world.
Well, in the introduction that was given, I say anything I say in the classroom might be used in a Bible study or a sermon, which is wonderfully frightening sometimes. Sometimes we say things in the classroom and think, did I really mean to say that? So talking with them about this. I teach a class on the Book of Psalms, and we spend time talking about the various approaches. How do we read the Psalter today? Not just as sort of, and you will see when we get to the embodiment theme for the next one, not just as these sterile words, but as words that can really stir us today. And I think the church, I come from a Baptist tradition at McAfee. I think the church is getting there. We're moving there. But I think the more we can teach our students, and the more our students can take messages of what the biblical text really has to say about our standing in this world. I think we've used those Genesis passages way too much. We can have dominion, we can subdue, we can put everything under our feet. And so I think as we continue to talk about and discuss, and that's why I spend so much time with the Hebrew words themselves. I think that various English translations, they're wonderful. I teach a history of the Bible course, and so we talk about all those various translations, but really getting underneath it to those. Hebrew is a very concrete language. That word compassionate is rachum, which comes from the womb. So all those words, and I think if we can help our students really dig into the text, understand what it has to say, and kind of get away from our ideas about this exalted place of humanity in the world. Have them read Balcom's book. It's a wonderful piece. Any other ideas from folks? How do we get this? How do we get the word out? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carrie. I'm an MDiv student here.
Okay.
Just wondering, so there are people in my life that I recognize understand the idea that like all creation is equally embodying Christ, but don't feel the same kind of urgency that to take care of the planet, because they're not in proximity to some of the issues that are happening with the planet. Like, they don't live near the ice caps that are melting, or the animals near them aren't in danger of extinction, or they aren't in proximity to the future problems of the world continuing to kind of fall apart because of our actions. So how do you kind of bring this message to people who aren't necessarily in direct proximity to some of the issues, or who don't necessarily understand that they are in proximity to the issues?
That is a very, very good question. I have a wonderful story. My family and I own a farm in Evansville, Indiana, an old 100-acre homestead, and a neighbor family farms it, but everyone grows the same thing: corn, wheat, and soybeans. What do we do with corn, wheat, and soybeans? Corn, ethanol. Soybeans, cattle food. So we're not, and the types of fertilizers they use and that sort of thing, I know are bad for the environment. How do we change a whole culture? Everyone grows corn, wheat, and soybeans using basically the same mechanism. So I struggle with that every time I go to my farm, but it's part of that culture. How do we get the word out to people? Just little things. I'm a fanatic recycler, so if somebody tries to throw something away in my house that should go in the recycling bin, I get on to them. If I see that happening at school. I'm also famous in my classroom when students bring in snacks. I'll say, read the ingredients on there. What does it really say is in the stuff you're eating? So maybe, those little kinds of things. And we're living in more of a global world. I think people are becoming more aware. But like those old farmers in southern Indiana, there are certain ingrained things that are stuck there. And I'm sure they care about the environment, but it doesn't, as you pointed out, doesn't really register because they're not seeing the direct effects of it all. Yeah. Back over here.
Hi, Max Lee, North Park, teaching at North Park Theological Seminary in New Testament. I'm also moderating the online discussion, but this is my own question, not the student's question. So I wanted to ask a twofold question, because the first part is I've seen some positive, I've heard creation's positive response to their creator, and the admonishment on humanity to take its role and place with cosmic humility in the Psalms. I'm just wondering, are there places where when humanity fails to live into its calling and doesn't manage or be wise over creation, does creation respond back? Because at least in the New Testament, we have in Romans 8 that all creation is in travail until the epiphany of humanity. So they're waiting for the resurrection, because as soon as humanity is resurrected, then God starts creating new heaven and new earth. And the redemptive work of God now has cosmic reach. And those are big themes in the book of Revelation. So I'm just wondering where in the Psalms, or maybe even the Old Testament canon, where the failure of humanity to offer creation care is answered by the activity of God, or a calling on humanity to repent.
Got two things I want to respond to about that. I think probably a place that we would really be able to find that kind of material would be in the prophets. I'm thinking particularly of Isaiah and Jeremiah. Some of those words about the people have sinned. Here's what's going on. Jeremiah in particular. If I flip through my Bible, I might be able to find something. So I think the prophets would be perhaps a good reflection of that. And of course, I think some of the Psalms in the Psalter also talk about, beyond the Enthronement Psalms, that idea of the earth feeling the effects of humans' disuse and uncare for it. But you brought up another interesting point. I think one of the main issues, and I'm not getting myself in trouble here, in Western Christianity in particular, is this idea that our faith is based on what happens to me after I die. Yeah? I want to be good in this world so that I can go to heaven. And so there's this seeming lack of concern for the earth because it's temporary. It's not going to be around. There'll be a new heaven and a new earth. So I don't particularly have to take care of this world. And one of the strong feelings I have about my own Christian faith is I'm not going to worry about what happens when I die. I'm more worried about what I do here on this earth. And I think that, again, I come from a strong Baptist tradition, and so I think that's even more ingrained within the Baptist world. If we can somehow bring people around to say, no, it's not all about what happens when you die. It's about what you do. We've tended to preach from a resurrected Jesus, and we forget about Jesus' life here on earth. So we do the death and resurrection, and we forget what Jesus taught while he was here. So.
Another question?
Another one.
I'll have another question, Nathan Clayton again. I'm wondering if you see ancient Israel, especially maybe starting with David and Solomon, and the urbanization that happens there in the Iron Age, and the development thereupon, in the divided monarchy. Does ancient Israel, do they stand as good global citizens? Are they good examples of living well in the land? Can we learn from them? Is the judgment that they occur partly for their not treating the land well? I'm just wondering if you've thought about those issues at all.
I think our ancestors in the faith were much more in tune with the earth than we are. That if they didn't grow their food, they didn't eat it. If they didn't care for the animals, they would not have milk and cheese and that sort of thing. So I think there was a deeper sense of being in touch with the earth. That's one of the reasons I garden, just to get my hands in the dirt. But I think there was also this idea of we got this vast land ahead of us, in front of us. We can do pretty much what we want to with it. So you get a lot of the stories of destruction and that sort of thing. So I think there was a mix. But I do think our ancestors, even my grandparents who owned this farm that I now covet and love wonderfully, were more in touch with the earth. I think much more in touch with caring for the earth. So I think there was kind of a mix. That's interesting. I'd like to go and have a look at that a little more in the biblical text and see what I can discover.
Phil Starseth, I'm a pastor in the neighborhood and an alum. Just fascinated by your work. First of all, thank you so much. Fascinated by your passion around this idea of birthing and the Hebrew language behind it. And given that these texts fall after Psalm 89 and the idea of a Davidic line, in the study that you did with that language and that word, did you see even beyond the creation stuff, a sort of a maybe enthronement or messianic language as you just studied that word of birthing? I mean, are we looking for somebody from the Davidic line coming?
I'm one of those proponents of we need to read the Old Testament for what it is. And so I tried very hard to keep the New Testament out of the Old Testament when I teach. I think that's something you certainly could do, but I think these Psalms stand beautifully alone as a reflection of our Creator God, and of course, Jesus is a part of that Creator God. But I think we tend to jump too quickly to messianic ideas in the Old Testament. So I tend to stay away from that, but yeah. Go ahead.
I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah,
But wouldn't
yeah.
your kind of premise is that this is a post-exilic group of people that are looking for salvation?
Mm-hmm,
They're looking for Messiah. So it doesn't even have to be Jesus. I think we as Christians would go that route. But do you see in this, Psalm 89 talks about, just this text right in the transition to these texts we're dealing with, talks about the Davidic covenantal. And I've been playing in my own study with this idea of what were they looking for that they maybe saw in Jesus. So kind of really going back to that post-exilic time with that language.
And that's one of the major debates. Those of us who study the shape and shaping of the Psalter, one of the things that we've gone back and forth on is, I sort of am in Gerald Wilson's camp that says that the book of Psalms says you will not have an earthly sovereign. You won't have a Messiah per se. You must trust in God as sovereign. Others say that the book of Psalms, particularly in book 5, does kind of look forward to hoping for a Messiah. We have this large clump of Davidic psalms in book 5. So some would say that indicates that there is a hope for a future, and whether it's Jesus or another anointed one. So kind of that back and forth. So I think you could argue both directions. I tend to think that the Psalter itself was shaped by this group who said, no, we have to honor God as sovereign. So.
Our last question is an online question, and then we'll take a break before we come back.
Hi, I have a question from Jonathan Fogel, one of our seminary graduates. He's a pastor at Hope Covenant Church. It's a complex question, so I'm going to try to make this as simple as I can.
Sit down,
he refers to an article in The Guardian which says that avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on the earth. And his question is that how do we deal with the abomination that is the corporate meat industry, which causes more ecological damage than any other human activity, not the least of which is water usage? Since we have new technologies that allow us to have a healthy, animal-free, non-meat eating lifestyle, what would be the Christian response? To both the global meat production and how we should live individually. I would say I think what he's asking is also based on your reading the Psalms and thinking theologically about them and applying them. What would the Psalms contribute to this question?
They say you're absolutely right, my friend. Yeah. My husband and I just recently have decided that we're only going to eat fish and poultry. So we're maybe some steps towards, avoiding all of that. But you're absolutely correct. When you think, again, I'm going to go back to my grandparents. They kept chickens and hogs and, a little before my time, cows as well, and they did their own butchering. I suspect if any of us in this room had to butcher our own animals for consumption, we'd think twice. But my grandparents raised these animals and I think somehow honored them. Yes, they were food, but they were taken care of. When we think about the mass production today, I think if any of us had to go to a butcher or an abattoir and see what actually goes on, and we are a consumer-driven society. And I think those Enthronement Psalms, Richard Balcom's words, tread a little more lightly on this earth. So,
Let's say thank you again.
Okay, thank you.